it might seem like a little bit of random bringing up of things that Van Drunen and others have said to give you a sense of where this is coming from, because you might recognize some of these sentiments in other authors. For example, there is a general critique of Christendom. You'll hear the word, and sometimes it's linked to Constantinianism, or a more general term, triumphalism. And those things can apply to wider scopes of criticism. But Christendom, Van Drunen writes this in Politics After Christendom, page 15. Under Christendom, Christianity sought to be a civil power as well as a spiritual power. Okay? What student of history can deny that Christians often attempted to conflate the keys of the kingdom with the sword of the state? It's not incredibly controversial as a historical statement. But while subtle, there's actually an equivocation of a key term here: Christianity. What do I mean by that? Well, what exactly is meant by Christianity sought to be a civil power? Under Christendom, Christianity sought to be a civil power. Christianity as a worldview. Christianity is true about all things. We grant that the Bible speaks to different subject matters to greater and lesser extents, to more general and specific degrees. But there's a lot of things, and a lot of things are not being addressed at all. And some people would say, well, churches should not speak to this area or to that because we have no competence in those areas. You say, what are you talking about? Christianity, all truth is God's truth. Sure, they'll say, but it doesn't speak with that specificity to that area, because that's not what the Bible is. It's not a manual for biology, and it's not a manual for practicing law, and so forth and so on. But surely all people can agree that to the extent that the Bible does speak to the civil sphere, to that same extent, such speech about the state would be both true speech and therefore biblical truth. So a lot of people don't have a problem saying that, no, Christians can speak to politics, but we have to speak the language of natural law, which, by the way, I'm a big advocate of, but I'm not going to mean what Van Drunen means by that, because they want to say that that's natural law, not biblical truth in that sense. So what's happening in the 2K, and I'll if I say 2K, that's shorthand for two kingdom. That's the way we talk. What's happening in the 2K Christendom critique is that the adjective Christian is functioning as a weasel word. It's setting up a straw man to oppose the historical view, to assert a Christian view of politics under this critique means to impose spiritual prerogatives, to speak this way, to church to speak with their book over this, is to impose, what they're suggesting is to impose spiritual prerogatives belonging to Christians only in the new creation, and imposing that upon the unbelieving world, even by physical means. Okay? So that's what's being subtly communicated in that idea of the Christendom critique. Now, we understand that there is was such a thing, and in people's mind is such a thing as Christendom, and that there was much wrong in that project, starting with Constantine. But surely what was wrong with it was not that the Christian worldview does in fact speak authoritatively over every single area of life. Okay, and there's much more that can be said in defense of the traditional view. But let's at least start there. In fact, hopefully I have said it so simple that I might draw the criticism, come on, that's a straw man. Who are you arguing against? I welcome that at this point, because at least then I've been clear, just to get things started. Okay. Do we have time to talk about anything else? I mean, that gets us off to a good start. Let me just give you a summary of Van Druenen's thesis. We're not even at chapter 1 yet. We'll try to do a chapter at a time. But let me just give you a summary of his thesis. And this is from page 16 of Politics After Christendom. Van Druenen makes a case that there is a biblical political theology. So in other words, he's not going to be one of these fideists in that sense, or old-time fundamentalists, I guess, such an escapist that he's going to say, well, the Bible has nothing to say about politics. We can't talk about political theology. He's actually not saying that. So there is a biblical political theology, but that while it is consistent with being good citizens in this world, part of being good pilgrims passing through, it's the basic thrust of a sound political theology is to prepare Christians for another world. Okay. And so he says on page 18 that God has instituted and rules political communities. So, see, God rules over political communities. And he says Christians should be active within them and promote their welfare. But Christians ought not to seek the kingdom within such communities. Okay. And now we turn back to them and say, well, who's he arguing against? Are there people that are guilty of that? Absolutely. All different kinds of people have been guilty of sort of what we call kingdom now theology, or used to be called that. So we are involved. We are good citizens, and that means we get involved in politics. But we ought not seek the kingdom within such political activity. There I give an interrogative amen. Usually we want to stay away from the interrogative tone, but at that point, Truman, Carl Truman writes the foreword to the book, and this is where I'll end out of time, to sort of set the tone of the book. The first words of Carl Truman's foreword, I think, show at least a potential presupposition that's shared with the vast majority of the political spectrum in the church, where he says, quote, "It is clear that the church in the West is facing a political situation in which it has lost most, if not all, of its traditional power and influence." And of course, as a descriptive statement, as an observation, nobody would disagree with that. I would ask anybody, really, in what sense should such a you want to call it pessimistic, it's true, in what sense should such an observation be a starting point? And I always want to drill fellow amillennialists and postmillennialists on this when we start using language like optimism and pessimism. I just don't think those words should have any bearing on the connection between eschatology and ethics. I understand they do. They should not, and we'll talk about that in the weeks to come as well. But what's the prevailing premise today about that? It's this. It is that temporal viability is the basic antecedent to ethical motive. Let me say that again. The assumption today in Christian ethics is that temporal viability of your program, of how it's going, but it's not the kingdom, they'll say out of the other side of their mouths. Temporal viability is the basic antecedent to ethical motive. And that takes a lot of forms. But the notion that diminished influence, diminished Christian influence in a culture ought to radically change our view toward what is right in the civil sphere is illogical, immoral, and unbiblical. Okay, so hopefully that gives you at least whets your appetite. Didn't get very far, but these circles are really what I wanted to start out, because what they're going to cash out into is this: church, the very familiar breakdown. church civil sphere, ecclesial sphere, civil sphere, whatever words you want to use, and the effect of it, regardless of what they say, to say, but no, we should be involved. There should be Christian policemen, Christian judges, Christian this. Just don't seek the kingdom there. The effect of that is this: the wall. And the setting of this over this in judgment. Well, why is that the effect of it? Well, one of the things they do is to say that, well, we don't have competence in those areas. That's natural law. That's common grace. Leave that to the experts. Well, who are the experts? Well, the experts are the people that your common society says are the experts. Well, who are those always? So think about that. Think about what the effect of that, what I would regard to be an ethical pluralism. What tendency does that have in how you even define what expertise is? There's been a crash course in that over the past year. So there we go. I'll end there, and then we'll get to Van Drunen chapter 1 in our next installment.